Murder on Sunday Morning was a documentary that highlighted a lot of problems with law enforcement and legal actions that took place in this court case. This case took place in Jacksonville, Florida, at a hotel in May. Brenton Butler was a 15-year-old kid, freshman in high school, minding his own business on the side of the street. Somewhere very close by, there was an egregious murder that took place. Mary Ann Stevens was a 64-year-old Georgia woman there on vacation with her husband, who was approached by a 6 foot to 6'4" black gentleman, 20 to 25 years old, was the original eyewitness identification by her husband shortly after the murder. She was attacked, attempted to have her purse stolen, which was eventually stolen, and dumped in a dumpster miles away with the money still in the purse. When police arrived on the scene to do a thorough investigation, they saw Brenton Butler walking down the street nearby, pulled him aside, and threw him in the back of the police car, put handcuffs on him, brought him over to the scene of the crime, and James Stevens pointed at the man and said, "That's the guy who killed my wife. I wouldn't put an innocent man in jail." That was enough for law enforcement to take Brenton Butler away from his family, take him away from his sophomore year of high school, and throw him in jail for 6 months and participate in the trial where he was wrongly accused of murdering this woman. He was indigent, so was assigned public defenders Patrick McGinnis and Ann Finnell, who did a wonderful job compiling evidence against this terrible accusation of this crime. There are a few important case theories that go into this trial, including the usage of public defenders within the criminal justice system. We hear how public defenders have high caseloads, aren't compensated correctly, work for the state for a lot of hours without the benefits of being able to spend enough time on their case to make ample defense. However, Patrick McGinnis and Ann Finnell did a fabulous job compiling evidence against law enforcement brutality, including when Brenton Butler was brought into the woods and savagely attacked by law enforcement officials, leading to bruises on his face, and as well as coerced confession that led after an 8-hour interrogation. Law enforcement pressures on the legal system are another reason that this case is really important, because after these law enforcement officials were participating in these acts of violence against Brenton Butler and these illegal procedures that they shouldn't have been taking place in, the prosecutor was forced to still attempt to pursue this case. Putting Brenton Butler on trial and attempting to have him convicted of this crime would have totally saved the credibility of all these officials who committed these acts that they shouldn't have been involved in. There are also racial undertones in this case because Brenton Butler, a young 15-year-old black man walking down the street nearby to the scene of the crime, is thrown into the back of a police car just due to the fact that he looks similar to the person who was supposedly the eyewitness identification. There is an extreme lack of physical evidence to support this conviction. Brenton Butler had no ties to the scene of the crime other than being nearby. He had an alibi with his mother seeing him shortly before and shortly after the murder, as well as his story that he was going to apply to different jobs at the time that this murder was happening. They didn't attempt to go to the places that he applied to and ask them if he seemed nervous. They didn't attempt to verify this story because the law enforcement had an idea that Butler was the murderer and wanted to pursue that by all means necessary. Victim identification procedures played a really large role in this case. Brenton Butler was down the street from the murder scene, thrown into a police car with handcuffs, brought up to James Stevens, and of course, anyone who had a vague memory of a traumatic event, such as your wife being murdered, is going to want to find the murderer as soon as possible. Butler didn't match the original identification that Stevens made to the police officers who were looking for the suspect. It was supposed to be an older gentleman, a taller gentleman, and yet Butler was still accused as the murderer by Stevens. This broke a lot of rules on identification procedures, whereas it should be an unbiased location, an unbiased situation, and having this young man in handcuffs in the back of a police car did not meet that criteria. Coerced confessions was a big part of this case because investigators interrogated Butler for 8 hours, a long investigative process, used techniques that he learned at a specific school on how to get confessions out of suspects, and it totally didn't match up with the story that actually happened later on when they did more investigations. As we do a critical evaluation of this case, we see that law enforcement actions played a big role in why this case wasn't able to be tried and wasn't able to be convicted on Butler's side. The prosecution attempted to try to save the credibility of these officers. However, bruises on the face of Butler, as well as this confession that didn't match up with stories, showed that law enforcement was pressuring Butler, was pressuring everyone else involved in the case to attempt to get a conviction where it shouldn't have happened. Police interrogation is a critical part of any case. However, when done the correct way, can lead to a good confession. When done incorrectly, it can lead to an invalid confession. This interrogation that lasted over the span of 8 hours, with investigators that were pressured to get a conviction based on what happened prior, and really led to a situation where the confession didn't match up with the evidence that was presented at the end of the day. The motives of the prosecution were to save the credibility of those involved prior, who made mistakes such as the police brutality and the coerced confession. The prosecutor attempted to try to discredit witnesses and discredit the Butler family. However, that really wasn't an option that the jury believed, and which is why it came back that he was not guilty. There are many possible applications that this case can do to the criminal justice field. Suspect identification procedures is very important. This is the first chance for law enforcement to attempt to find a suspect. Eyewitness identification can be a really good tool in order to find suspects for a crime. However, when done incorrectly, leads to unrightful suspects being accused when they weren't involved in the case at all. The treatment of suspects and victims during investigation is another thing that needs to be really looked at in this case. Having Butler unsupervised by anyone taken out into the woods was a terrible idea from the onset. Whether police brutality occurred there or not, you need to have some sort of checks and balances in place in order to ensure that those involved in a case have no possible way of accusing law enforcement of any unrightful action. Another thing is the full independent investigations that can take place in the future when these cases do come to be. Having law enforcement do an initial investigation is something that's important. However, when the initial investigation leads to subsequent investigations, this could lead to passion in a place where it shouldn't be. Having an independent investigator or a different law enforcement agency come in and do an independent investigation following the initial one would really do a lot to either rebut the first investigation or solidify the findings from the first investigation. Although this could be a costly procedure, it will ensure that no one is wrongfully convicted of a crime and that justice is served. This case proved that Butler wasn't involved in this murder and did a lot to show how law enforcement actions can do a lot to make a suspect seem guilty when he absolutely is not.